It's the destiny of the human race expressed in numbers, and it's the reason the Empire will take us.
They're worried you can predict the future.
They're worried people believe I can, and they don't like the future I predict.
Which is what?
If you've read Isaac Asimov's Foundation books, watched my intro videos, or read any of the press about the TV show, then you know the story spans a long period of time. If not, there's a monologue from Gaal Dornick to open the series that sets it up. What's interesting here is that it comes from the perspective of the future. She says that one day she'll learn the names Salvor Hardin, Hober Mallow, and the Mule. As she's talking, viewers are introduced to Salvor, the planet Terminus, and the mysterious vault that hovers above the ground there. We see some local kids try to approach it and get an explanation from Salvor, who they refer to as the Warden, that the vault is warning them to stay away, although it's implied that she's not affected by the null field it generates. Right off the bat, you get the idea that the story is going to be big. You're introduced to 2 timelines and 3 planets in the first 10 minutes. The narration shifts from the future to remembering the past, and you meet Harry Seldon and his adopted son Rach 35 years prior at the Imperial Library on the Empire's capital planet Trantor. They're discussing Gaal's arrival, and then we meet her on her homeworld of Synnax. You see her looking at her prayer stones that she removed before her journey to Trantor to meet Harry. These are cultural markers that every member of the Seers Church has in their cheeks. You get the feeling that her leaving has set her apart from her people, and later learn that math and science go against their beliefs. As you learn more about her background, you find out that the waters are rising on Synnax, threatening their way of life, and the people have turned to faith for answers. This led to the universities being burned down and a purge of intellectuals. Gaal taught herself math hoping to help save her people. She won a contest by solving a problem called the Abraxas conjecture, which no one had been able to figure out for over 500 years. After that, she gets offered a job by Harry Seldon and says goodbye to her parents before leaving Synnax for good. She gets transported to a jump ship, which is our introduction to the hyperspatial travel that made it possible for humans to settle on habitable planets throughout the galaxy. She meets a man named Gerald just before they're put to sleep for the jump. He turns out to be an agent of the Empire that was sent to spy on her. He tells her they have to be put to sleep because sometimes it can feel like your mind and body are taking different trips. They have to be secured in these pods because the artificial gravity has to be turned off so they can navigate the jump. For some reason, Gaal wakes up while they're in transit, which is strange, and she's immediately sedated by one of the spacers working on the ship. If you're curious as to what these spacers are, I'll come back to them after the recap. When she arrives on Trantor, she takes the star bridge down to the planet, and there's a lot of world building in the details while she's on her way to meet Rach, who takes her to Harry. You learn that billions of people live below the surface on 100 subterranean levels where they never see the sun or the stars. Trantor is an ecumenopolis. The entire planet is encompassed by the city. As the surface became completely developed, they started to build down, and then they do things like projecting skies overhead on the lower levels to make it look more natural. Harry asks her some questions about how she solved the problem in an effort to get to know her, and then he drops it on her that they're going to be arrested tomorrow. When she asks why, he questions if she's familiar with his work on psychohistory. He says it's the destiny of the human race expressed in numbers. When she hears this, she asks if they're worried that he can predict the future, and he says that they're worried that people believe he can, and they don't like the future he predicts. He tells her that Trantor is going to be destroyed and the Empire will fall. When he shows her the prime radiant, which is the visual representation of his equations, she realizes that they believe she's the only one that can prove him wrong. Harry agrees that that's true. If he was wrong, she would be able to prove it, but he's not. This is all bad news for her. She left home where she would have been arrested, only to find out she'll face the same thing on Trantor. On the way out, she asks Rach to take her to a seer church, and the priest knows who she is. And he isn't a fan of Seldon's prophecies either. You also meet the genetic dynasty of Dawn, Day, and Dusk. They're all clones of Emperor Cleon I, who have been ruling for 4 centuries. You see that they do consider Seldon as a threat, and also that they can be cruel when Day kills a man who's been working for him for over 60 years just for being in possession of something that Harry wrote. The three versions of the same person at three different ages have complete control of the Empire. Day sits on the middle throne as the leader until Dawn grows old enough to take his place. Dusk advises his younger selves and the cycle continues. Ado Demerzel is their first minister and appears to assist in managing everything. On top of going after Harry and Gaal, the Cleons are dealing with a dispute over resources between two planets that hate each other, Anacreon and Thespis. Because some agents of the Empire were killed in the dispute, they've been summoned to answer for that and to try to avoid an all-out war. Gaal and Harry are arrested and their trial is public. Regular citizens are able to watch it, with the Cleons watching very closely. Harry explains that psychohistory is a predictive model designed to forecast the behavior of very large populations. When questioned as to what it says about the Empire, he says it's going to fall in 500 years or possibly sooner. They accuse him of trying to undermine an empire that's existed for 12,000 years. And he pleads that he's not a revolutionary, it's just what the math says. He claims the collapse is too far along, it can't be stopped, but they can shorten the 30,000 years of barbarism that's going to follow it. They can cut that to just 1,000 years. He can't prove any of this. His predictions can't be checked because no one really understands the math except for Gaal. So after the first day of questioning, Gerald comes back and gives Gaal the Prime Radiant. He tells her that she has to disavow Harry and say that his math is wrong. And if for some reason the equations turn out to be correct, the Empire will deal with that. They'll fix the problems without terrifying trillions of people. He gives her an ultimatum. Either she says that Harry's wrong and he dies, and if she doesn't, she dies. When she takes the Prime Radiant back to her room, she's able to activate it and see the equations. In court the next day, Harry is asked directly how he would shorten the period of chaos. His plan is to create an Encyclopedia Galactica. Essentially, collect all of mankind's knowledge and then print it and distribute it. After the fall, a new empire will rise from the ashes, and this will serve as a foundation of knowledge for them to build upon. When they call Gaal to testify, she goes against the Empire, verifying that Seldon's math is correct, and she confirms that the Empire is dying. As they're leaving the courtroom, she senses that something's wrong with the Starbridge and tells Harry about it. Then it cuts to two simultaneous suicide bomber attacks on the bridge and the platform. You see it kill everyone there as it falls out of orbit to wrap around the planet, tearing 50 levels down. There's 100 million people dead, and there's a fear that the outer reaches may be in rebellion. Rach gives Gaal a chance to give Harry up, but she refuses and they're taken in front of the Emperor. Harry's work has convinced him that things are going to get worse, so the Starbridge attack isn't a surprise. He doesn't say that he predicted that that would happen specifically, but it sounds like he knew something would. And he explains he can't figure out who did it because he can't predict individuals' actions. And then when asked if the fall can be slowed down, he says yes, they need to end the genetic dynasty. Dusk gets angry about that, saying that the dynasty stopped the wars. Harry stands by it. He says that change will help things, but there's no movement on either side. When Day asks why they shouldn't just kill Harry, Gaal steps in and says that it would actually speed things up, that she saw that when she looked at the equations. She says that Harry's Hope, and if they kill Hope, then the people will kill them. When they're alone together, Gaal realizes the contest was set up to find someone that could understand Seldon's equations. He just reached out and got to her before they did. They're brought back in and told that the decision is to let them continue their work on psychohistory, but not on Trantor. They're being allowed to travel by slow ship to an uninhabited planet called Terminus, which of course we saw at the beginning. Without a jump ship, the trip will take them years. They've been exiled, and if psychohistory turns out to be fraudulent, then the Foundation will just be allowed to wither. And if it's useful, the Empire can just co-opt it for themselves. Terminus is on the periphery, and it neighbors the two kingdoms that are apparently behind the Starbridge attack. On the way out, Gaal begins to realize that exile was always Harry's plan. He says the planet is perfect for what they need to do. And that's the twist, is that even though he was gambling to a certain extent on these things, everything had been planned in advance, and it did work out how he expected. He tells her, "You came here to save your world, why not think bigger? Save the galaxy." And then it cuts to Terminus 35 years later. The narration picks back up, saying no one could approach the vault except for an outlier like Salvor Hardin. Gaal says she always wondered if when Harry was formulating the plan, did he realize the galaxy's fate would rest on what she found inside? She thinks he did, and thinks that's what he feared the most.
The believers who threw their lot in with an eccentric that pinned the fate of the galaxy on the back of a theorem so abstract. Well, it might as well have been a prayer.
In the beginning of episode 2, the Cleons still can't figure out who contracted the people who were responsible for the Starbridge attack. Demerzel's looking into it. She goes to a biohacking place at one point, and without anything else to go on, Brother Day still just kind of wants to kill Harry. But Demerzel won't let it happen because she knows there's nothing to connect him to the crime. Both Anacreon and Thespis deny being involved, and that seems like they're probably telling the truth. They hate each other, so it doesn't really make sense for them to collaborate on the attack. We see that Dusk is getting old, and we see that there's a natural tension that exists between him and Day. We can imagine that this probably always happens. And he goes to see the seer priest at the church that Gaal went to, where he sees the destruction of what happened firsthand. He's trying to find out if Gaal is a seer. Based on the weird stuff we've seen around her, it's an interesting question. While they're there, Demerzel gets hit by a falling rock, and then later we see Brother Dawn watching as she repairs herself. In that, she's revealed to be a robot. And you may have noticed that there aren't any real robots around in Trantor as it is. Brother Dawn says that all of her kind had died, and she corrects him saying they didn't die, they were destroyed by his kind. So she does her best to act like a human, and at this point, it's not really clear how well her true identity is covered up. After talking to the Anacreon and the Thespin they have in their custody, Dusk decides that mercy is the right way to go. Brother Day doesn't listen and decides to make an example of the Outer Worlds. He sends ships to attack the planet and then executes the members of the delegation who came to Trantor, but leaves the two leaders alive to go back and tell their people how they failed. There's a teaching moment here for Brother Dawn. Demerzel tells him it won't always be like this. When he asks exactly how often do they choose to do things like this, she just says you always do. On the slow ship, Gaal and Rach have started a relationship that's getting serious, and you learn that there's 4 months and 4 years left of the trip. You see that everyone's getting prepared to live. They're learning new skills. You meet some of the new characters that would still be around in Salvor's timeline. If nothing else, the colonists look serious. They believe that the Empire is going to fall, and what they're doing is going to be very important with the Foundation to preserve knowledge and rebuild the civilization. There's a side story here about a pregnancy that Gaal's involved in. It appears that women who get pregnant opt to preserve that until after they make it to Terminus. So it makes you wonder if Rach and Gaal won't be the parents of somebody who turns out to be important. And I guess it should be noted that Salvor Hardin isn't born yet. We do see the two characters here that are cast to play her parents when they're much younger than what they'll be in that timeline. But otherwise, I don't see how this pregnancy thing is really essential if it's not going to pay off later. Either way, they're trying to hide their relationship from Harry, and in his interactions you can see that he realizes that the Foundation is going to be successful. At least the plan is fully in motion, but that his time with it is coming to an end. The calculations show that it's going to be a tough road for the people who are left behind. Something like a mortality rate of 34.2% after 5 years on Terminus. Although he says this is trending downward, so their training is working. In their conversation, there's also a mention of the robot wars and the hanging of AI sympathizers in an orchard in the Imperial Gardens. This all refers back to what Demerzel was telling Brother Dawn about her kind being destroyed by humans. The episode comes to an end as Gaal's following her normal routine. She's in the pool swimming, and then she gets a feeling that something's wrong and decides to leave. She goes looking for Rach and can't find him, and that leads her to Harry's room where she sees Rach stabbing him and taking his life. We also see that Rach takes something from behind his ear before he goes after her. And then he puts her in a pod, throwing his knife inside, telling her that he loves her, and then he launches it. The pod seems to be programmed, and it looks like she's probably being put to sleep for a period of time. It's definitely not clear if her interrupting what happened in Harry's room is why she's on the pod, as all of her interactions with Harry earlier made it seem like he was grooming her to be the leader on Terminus. He even sent her to that meeting to sit in his place. It's definitely possible that she interrupted because of that feeling she had, and then Rach had to change his plan, which we're going to have to wait and see what was really going on with that, because all of his interactions with Harry portrayed them having a close and loving relationship. There was the awkward interaction at dinner. We hadn't seen anything like that between them before. Everything we'd seen from Rach was that he was concerned, even though he might not have been 100% positive that Harry was right. And there definitely are seeds planted there where it could go the other way. Gaal telling him that the math wasn't complete, and it's a pretty good cliffhanger when you think about it like that. So I'm excited to see where it goes in the next episode. So to wrap it all up, Harry used psychohistory to forecast the fall of the Empire. He believes what the math is telling him and knows that the Cleons will never give up their power willingly. By solving Abraxas when no one else could, Gaal is considered the best person to check if his work is correct. She gets pulled into the situation, she decides to go against the Empire, and this all leads to all these people on the slow ship being exiled to Terminus to create the Foundation. There's quite a few mysteries to think about. First and foremost, who's really behind the attack on the Star Bridge? It definitely doesn't seem like the people that are being punished are the ones who did it, which means there could be blowback from that, but also that there could be another force in play. Gaal has plenty of mysteries around her too, this idea that she senses things. Why did she wake up during the jump? Where did she go at the end? Is she hibernating, and for how long? What was the significance of the zygote scene? Is part of the reason that they gender swapped this character because she's going to have descendants on Terminus? Why did Rach kill Harry? That feels like it was part of the plan, rather than some murderous rage. But then how did Gaal walking in change things? What was the device he took from behind Harry's ear? What's going on with the vault? How did it get there? Because it seems beyond Harry's natural skill set, although he did have a lot of people working for him. And what's going on with the Cleons having a robot? They kept Demerzel mostly in the background in these two episodes, but even if you don't know anything about the books, I'm sure she's starting to pique your interest.
We can still revisit the idea of marriage and an heir.
Demerzel, there are things you will never know.
I may someday know death.
Episode 2 ended on a big turn with Rach killing Harry Seldon and sending Gaal into space on an escape pod. A little later in this episode, we get a confirmation from Hugo that people do go into hibernation or cryosleep, and I assume that's there to let us know what happened to Gaal. Episode 3 opened with another turn, in that it opted not to provide the resolution or aftermath of the event on the ship, and instead decided to jump around on the timeline. The episode opens with another voiceover narration from Gaal talking about ghosts. The Empire's, and more specifically the palace of the Empire's ghost, is Cleon I. We go back in time 400 years to the end of his reign and see him planning with Demerzel for what comes after his death. This makes her role more explicit. You see that she was there to plan it, that she was involved in setting up the clone program and the transition, and that kind of implies that she was actually running the Empire for a period of time, since she says that the first brother Don they put on the throne was still a baby. There's an emphasis on loyalty here, her loyalty to the Empire, to Cleon's dynasty, and the question of if the Empire will be loyal to her. So far, we're only working with vague references to what's going on with robots in the TV show, which means all of this is still a mystery. From there, we jump to 19 years after the Starbridge bombing. It's the strange time in the cycle where Lee Pace is playing Brother Dawn. That doesn't last for long though, because it's Brother Dusk's last day before becoming Brother Darkness, or the end of his life, which they refer to as his ascension. This is the version of Dusk who was in favor of mercy for Anacreon and Thespis, and he's still thinking about that and what Harry Seldon said now that he's reaching the end. As a final present, they all go up to destroy what's left of the Star Bridge in orbit. As they're looking at it for the last time, Dawn and Day promise to make something better in Cleon's honor for the outgoing Dusk. We see that the work was ongoing when the original Cleon died. It then became a very visible reminder of his legacy on Trantor, and then of course it fell during the attack. Demerzel has been there from its beginning to its end, and she almost looks emotional here, and Dusk asks her about it later, in this odd exchange where he questions her love for him and her feelings for the original Cleon. She tells him that he's enough, but after he closes his eyes, she continues saying, "It's just that you always leave me." In the morning, he goes to his ascension. Brother Dawn becomes the new Brother Day, having grown into their greatness. The new Dawn is presented as the old Dusk is ready to incinerate himself, and something about that situation starts to feel wrong to him. There may be something to this because he's experienced this same ceremony in the past, but before we find out, Demerzel grabs his arm, starts to sing to him, and then encourages him on his way to meet his end. From there, the story jumps forward another 17 years, where we meet the 14th edition of Cleon, who was the baby that was crying at the ceremony as he's becoming a young man. After that, we transition to see the colonists arrive on Terminus. Because everything about their landing is planned out, they're surprised to find the vault when they get there. As they approach it, they experience the null field and everyone gets knocked out. They scuttle the slow ship, they crash it on the surface, and then they build up the colony. There's a brief scene of Salvor when she's younger. Her parents are talking about her being a dreamer or a thinker, and she seems to be fascinated by the vault. We fast forward to where she's grown and watch her do an experiment where she discovers that the null field is expanding. It's getting bigger. In her role as the warden, we see that she's working on this fence, this sort of generated field that protects their colony. And we also see the encyclopedist working to preserve knowledge to follow through on Harry's plan. Salvor takes her mother to the vault to show her that the null field is growing, and they talk about her connection to it, how her mother found her underneath it as a child. At the time, her parents kept this a secret because they didn't want her to be treated differently. We learn that Salvor was drawn to it. She thought it was calling to her, and then when she was underneath it, she couldn't understand why it was hurting her mother. When asked if she can hear it now, if it's calling her, she just says that she thinks it's waking up. So even though they kept it a secret, it's mentioned that she's still an outsider, and we see that she doesn't really mix with the other colonists. And to that, her mom reminds her that she's always been special. Her boyfriend Hugo, who's a traitor, arrives. He's got a 29-hour stop on the planet. We see some of their romance, some of their life, how that works. And after they have sex, she has a feeling which gets her out of bed, and she leaves to check the perimeter. She ends up seeing, or more likely imagining, a child running into the old ship. She's never able to catch up with it and to get a good look, but as viewers, we can see that he has what looks like Rachel's knife in his hand. He disappears after she follows him inside, and she just finds one of those bishop claw creatures that are native to the planet there. And when she scares it away, she notices something in the sky above the planet. Her and Hugo check it out through her telescope, and they realize that Anacreon ships have shown up. This is the first time anyone's come to the planet in 30 years. She takes this information to the encyclopedists, who don't really think it's a big deal. As far as they're concerned, they're a part of the Empire, they're protected by the Emperor, and all they need to do is just call them, let them know what's happening, and they'll intervene because, of course, this is Anacreon. When they attempt to make contact, they realize that the comms buoy isn't working. They look for rational reasons that this might be happening, things unrelated to what's going on with the ships above their planet, but Salvor is not convinced. She starts taking stock of the weapons and preparing for the worst, thinking that they just went by the buoy, so they probably destroyed it on their way. And we see the division here. She's considered an outlier. They actually call her that and basically dismiss anything that she says. They realize they have about 40 hours until they arrive. In an act of desperation, Salvor's mom pulls out the Prime Radiant, which she collected from Harry's room after he was killed, just to see if maybe Salvor will connect with it. Salvor had never seen it, doesn't know anything about it, and her mom asks her to take a look at it because if she was part of the plan, it would make it a lot easier to believe in it. She seems fascinated, but there doesn't seem to be anything that she can do. You see the equations swirl around and then sort of fall, but it's not clear if she had any effect on that at all. And before they leave, she makes the distinction that different is not the same as special. As they're waiting for the ships to get there, she has another feeling. She ends up chasing the vision of the young Rach again, but this time she finds the creature and notices it's been shot by an arrow. She finds herself surrounded with what looks like a group of warriors, saying that Anacreons are not allowed on Imperial soil. What are you doing here? And the episode ends there.
All Cleons are perfect genetic copies of the first.
We don't have souls. So, this Halima woman is saying we're what? Not human?
The episode opens with teenage brother Dawn. Remember, this was the baby who was presented at the Ascension ceremony. Timeline-wise, he was born 19 years after the Starbridge bombing, and then there was another 17-year time jump, so we're 36 years on from Harry Seldon's trial. To sync things up with Terminus, it took the colonists roughly 5 years to get there, and now they've been settled for 30 more. There's a bit of narration here with Gaal reinforcing the idea that psychohistory only predicts the movement of masses and not individuals. And it all tends to reinforce the idea that this particular clone of Cleon is different in some way, which could probably cause a problem for a predictive model that supposed that the Emperor would always stay the same. Regardless of that, there seems to be something wrong with him. He climbs out on his balcony and with a painful look on his face throws himself off the edge. There's a young gardener there working who witnesses his fall as his protective aura device saves him from becoming a bloodstain. What he was trying to accomplish isn't exactly clear. The young gardener gets scared and runs away. That leads to a side story where he looks into her and ends up spying on her after she gives him a tip about using a medicinal plant called wolf's breath. Her name's Azula. She's been working in the garden since she was a teenager, and it seems like she might be important later. We check in with Brother Day, who's with a courtesan. It gives us an insight into how he experiences pleasure and sexual satisfaction, and a little bit more about how their protective auras work. Before he can satisfy his physiological need for intimacy, Demerzel interrupts because the Proxima Opal is past. This is the leader of a religious faith, and it sounds like a powerful one considering it has trillions of followers. There's a potential problem here because there's a new candidate who has a chance to take over that follows something called the primary Octavia. This is a pre-imperial belief that centers around individuated sentience. Long story short, as clones, the Cleons could be viewed as less than human. Brother Day explains it to Dawn. He says if the galaxy comes to believe that their leaders are less than rather than more than, they may cease to follow. So there could be a legitimate threat to their power, and Brother Dusk plans to visit the Conclave in person to address the situation. Even though all this time has passed since the Starbridge attack on Trantor, there's still unrest. And we see there's an uprising in the lower levels from the heat sink workers. And the Cleons also learn about a communications buoy going offline in the Outer Reach. This prompts Brother Day to bring up Terminus and the exile of Harry Seldon's followers there. They have problems with the Conclave, there's unrest at home, and now there's problems in the Outer Reach. He asks his brothers if they're starting to see a pattern forming. Harry Seldon laid out these very problems that they're facing now, and at that time, Brother Day didn't do anything about it because he saw him as a charlatan. So there's a rift forming between Day and Dusk. The older has a reason to stick to what he did back in the past, even in light of all these new events starting to look like Harry's predictions are coming true. The current Brother Day summons the Royal Master statisticians to ask them about what they've learned about Harry Seldon's math. They've been working on it for 3 decades now and still don't really understand it. They believe the predictive models are counterfactual because since he made his predictions, the Empire has expanded rather than contracted in every meaningful metric. When pressed, though, they can't say that there's a non-zero chance that he isn't right about everything. In frustration, Day goes and calls out Dusk for his past mistakes with Anacreon, Thespis, and Terminus. He says he's not going to let him make the same mistakes and says that he'll go to the Conclave instead. Demerzel steps up and interjects that the primary Cleon has never left Trantor at any time in the Genetic Dynasty. But she isn't able to change his mind, so Dusk throws it out there that his brother is haunted by Seldon's ghost, and then he's sent back to Trantor, where he summons someone to go investigate the buoy going dark in the outer reaches. And he tells him that the dispatches from the Foundation have become sporadic. Pay them a visit and tell them the Empire won't be kept in the dark. So they'll be heading to Terminus. We visit there and pick up with Salvor, who ran into those Anacreons in the remains of the slow ship. They've been on the planet for a while scouting, and their story is that they're looking for the navigation module from the ship. They get Salvor to take the leader through the fence because she wants to go to the tower in the center of the city. It works out that she's only able to get the one person through, so the others tell her if she doesn't return in the time a watch has passed, they'll raze the city to the ground. On the way, Salvor has another vision and makes a move towards the vault where the Nullfield knocks her captor out. She takes her prisoner and figures out that she's the Grand Huntress, which gives them leverage. They can't really decide what to do with her, and Salvor thinks they need to get ready to defend themselves. She tries to get information out of Farah because she believes the navigation module is just a distraction. She shows her that she can predict the outcome of coin flips to sort of psych her out, and through the scars she has in her fake eye, puts it together that she must have been 5 or 6 when she survived the Empire's attacks on her planet. Salvor realizes where her resentment against the Empire comes from. It's from losing her mother and her brother, and she tells the others that she senses a deadness inside her, that she wants everyone to die. Salvor talks to the encyclopedist Louis Perrine, and you get a better understanding of why he disregarded her in the last episode. This idea he has of her being an outlier comes from the connection to the vault, which he says is something that couldn't have been predicted through psychohistory. After all, it can't account for individuals. He goes to talk to Farah, who mostly ignores him and this insistence he has that they're backed up by the Empire. She says all of them have been exiled and they're all dying just at different speeds. And she points out that Harry prophesied that the fall would begin at the edge of the galaxy. In their conversation, it starts to become clear that they destroyed the buoy and landed on Terminus to get a response from the Empire. They're just trying to provoke them, but it isn't clear what they're after or why they think they have a chance against them. The people on Terminus start to realize that there's a lot of Anacreons surrounding the city, and when Salvor goes outside, she has a different kind of vision. This one's pretty vivid. She's in the Imperial Library and almost looks like Gaal, at least the clothes she's wearing, and she sees the boy with Rachel's knife again. She's able to talk to him this time and says, "I won't hurt you, just tell me who you are." And there is no answer, and all of that starts to convince her that it's coming from the vault. She tells Hugo this. He says that she's special and that he has absolute faith in her. Farah starts to convince Louis to help her by telling him that they are technologically bankrupt ever since their atmosphere was set on fire. She continues the story that they need the navigation module because they have ships but can't make their way to a different system to rebuild their civilization. As Salvor's watching the troops outside the fence assemble a weapon, she thinks there's a larger strategy at play here, but she can't figure it out. The vault isn't Anacreon or alien at all. She believes it's from Harry, but she has this crisis of faith that maybe Louis is right. Maybe her being an outlier is the reason that things are going wrong, and maybe the visions are warning her to stay away. Hugo counters this by saying, "What if you are Seldon's plan?" Which I guess you can't blame him for not understanding how this works, and picking up on the fact that there is something going on with Salvor. We leave them, and in the closing moments we see the cryopod holding Gaal moving through space, and it approaches what looks like a spacecraft as it cuts to black, and the episode ends there.
What year is it? How long was I asleep?
12,102 Era Imperial. Your cryosession duration was 34 years, 223 days.
Season 1, Episode 5 opens with Gaal telling us about the stories that scared her the most as a child. They were about black holes. It was the idea of an event horizon. Venture into that, and the gravitational pull prevents you from turning back. Escape becomes impossible, and you could see the parallel of what's going on with her after she made the decision to try to solve the Abraxas conjecture. In flashback, we go back to see how that played out. At one point, Gaal was involved with the Seer Church. She was an acolyte, and this seems to be a point of pride for her parents, as her community has turned to their faith in light of this climate catastrophe that's going on their planet. The sea level's rising, that's threatening their way of life, and we hear how it's getting more and more difficult for her family to make their living through the farming of algae. We already understood this from the first episode, so the main thing here is this connection she has with an old family friend who's been labeled as a heretic. She finds him one night after going to the university, which is supposed to be abandoned. He's there looking through the books, and when she tells him that he needs to leave because the seers have condemned the building, he says that the books are heretical, right? That all analytical learning goes against the faith of the awakening. He says the line here that we heard her say to Rach, that when a planet wants you dead, you die. She tries to get him to leave without the books, and he offers her the writing from Callie, which is what she'll end up using to solve the problem that gets her to Trantor. The last thing he tells her is the cleanse will pass. All things have a cycle. The knowledge helps to survive the destruction until the rebirth arrives. And you see Gaal try to reframe his statements to fit the church's ideas that the floods are a challenge from the sleeper, that they just have to endure and then eventually it'll all get better. He counters that people did this, we did this, not the slumbering God. So this guy is the localized version of Harry Seldon, right? He sees this collapse is coming that can't be stopped by putting your faith into this church's system. Later we see him being executed for being a heretic. As an acolyte, Gaal is there. She has to help prepare him for the ceremony, and the books are submerged with him. His final statement is that this will not stop the seas from rising. And there's a seed planted there, so Gaal goes back alone later. She swims down and recovers Callie's writing, and even though she's starting to rise up in the ranks of the church, she starts reading about math. She uses her new knowledge to solve the Abraxas conjecture, and eventually she enters the competition and gets the message that she solved it and that Harry will validate her proof. He tells her that the Empire will be reaching out, but that he hopes that she'll come to Streeling University on Trantor to meet him. Which, of course, we've already seen her do that. We get a little bit more of her parents being pissed. Her father tells her he'd rather his daughter die than go to the machine world of Trantor. But at this point, knowing there's nothing left on Synnax but destruction, she's past the point of no return and decides to choose science over faith, hoping that she can find a way to save her people through getting off the planet and going to work with Harry Seldon. It cuts back to the present timeline, and we see her escape pod being brought inside this ship where she wakes up. She remembers Harry's death and notices that she has Rach's knife inside the pod. That comes in handy when she can't open the door. The knife is pulled into this slot and is basically the key. And as she goes inside, we realize that the ship's AI thinks that she's Rach, as it's initiating things for his arrival. She finds out she's alone there, and that the ship won't give her access to some functions because, again, she's not Rach. She's not the person the ship was expecting. She finds out that she was asleep for nearly 35 years, so what's happening here is happening at the same time as what's going on with Salvor and the Encyclopedist on Terminus. We see them, and it picks up right where they left off. Salvor's looking at the large weapon just outside the fence, and the fact that the Anacreons are using a cloaking device, they're hiding it from someone other than the people on Terminus, confirms that their motive goes beyond Terminus itself. And right at that moment, the Imperial jump ship arrives, and now we know what's going on. Back at Terminus City, you see that the Encyclopedists are thrilled that they actually came, that the Empire is backing them up, but also that this is exactly what Farah was hoping would happen. The ship, the Aegis, makes contact and essentially learn that they don't have any military. They talk to Salvor, who's the warden, and she explains that they confessed to destroying the communications buoy, and so he wants to talk to Farah directly to see what she has to say about that. Salvor thinks this is a mistake, but her communications are jammed before she can really say her piece, and then Lewis goes to get Farah and bring her into the tower. This sets off red flags. With the troops surrounding the fence, Salvor doesn't want Farah to go anywhere near the tower, and so she races to the city. There she realizes she's too late. Lewis is already taking Farah over to the tower, and there she pulls out a field disruptor that she hid in her fake eyeball, and when she detonates that shuts down the fence. The Anacreon warriors are then able to charge into the city, and you see that they are killing some of the colonists. The Imperial ship sees what's happening on the ground and starts to land, while Salvor is looking for Farah, who has taken her mother hostage. When she finds her, there's an intense standoff where Salvor won't drop her gun to save her mother, and after that works out, they have a crazy one-on-one fight where Salvor eventually gets the upper hand, but Farah's men are there, they have her mother again, so it's essentially a standoff. Later, when they're looking over the destruction, Farah points out that Terminus isn't innocent. She says that Seldon's predictions are what inflamed the Empire in the first place. Because of what their prophet said, her whole world burned. And there is some truth to that, I guess, from her perspective, although there is this ongoing mystery of who actually blew up the Star Bridge. The fighting continues on the ground. People are definitely dying. We see Hugo get shot. And then as the Imperial ship approaches, we see that the Anacreons were assembling that weapon in order to take out the ship, and we see it come down to the ground. So we see what their larger plan was, although it's not clear to me what the motivation behind it is. We're going to have to wait and see, because they're not actually in a position to be able to fight back if a full-blown battle breaks out with the Empire. It feels like it has to be more specific to that ship or this location, but we don't find out before the episode ends. Back on the ship, Gaal can't get authorized to do anything important like send a message or guide the ship somewhere different. She is able to do a search of the Imperial database though, and she learns that the slow ship did make it to Terminus. She looks into Harry's death. She finds out the official story is that he was murdered by Rach, and she's listed as an accomplice. And per his own directive, Harry was ejected in a casket he designed himself. And we do see his body being sent out into space. She searches for Rach and finds footage of him being questioned by the encyclopedists. Louis Perrin is now in charge after Harry's death. Rach admits that he murdered Harry and won't say much about it other than implying that he understands more about why things happened the way they did than Louis does. For his crime, he is executed, and we see him get spaced. They throw him outside in the vacuum without a suit. Before that happens, we see his final words. He says, "I know it's hard. I know what I've done seems incomprehensible, but you can never lose faith in the plan ever. You can still solve a puzzle even with a piece missing." And it almost feels like he's talking directly to Gaal here, knowing that he put her on the escape pod in his place. Of course, she breaks down after watching this, and there's a point where she briefly contemplates suicide. She brings a scalpel into the shower, thinking about her time with Rach, and then before she can go through with it, the ship changes its course, and that flips her around. It gives her a chance to think, and she decides to try to figure out what's going on. There's a somewhat long sequence where she can't find out where they're going. The ship won't tell her where they're going, so she uses the information she can get in math to figure out what direction they're going in. Then she can't see outside because there's a view screen, so she goes and she finds a suit, tethers herself, does a spacewalk. She can't see anything at first with the naked eye, but once she looks in infrared, she realizes they're heading towards a dark star. With that information, Gaal realizes that their destination is Helicon, Harry's homeworld, which we don't have a lot of background about in the show. And as she's figuring that out, she starts to see some strange things. She sees what looks like puddles of blood, and then she comes across a glitched out projection of Harry, where he looks like he did the last time she saw him, and the episode ends there. This is probably related to the device we saw Rach remove from behind his ear. Harry is dead, but now it's apparent there was more to his plan that would happen after that event.
Well, you hunt like a man. Do you consider yourself a man now?
I don't know. I suppose.
Only a man can replace the man.
The 6th episode opens with another narration from the future from Gaal, talking about Trantor and the emperor that would live forever, the man who had triumphed over death itself, the leader who never knew doubt in all his lifetimes until he met Harry Seldon. On his ship, we see that the current Brother Day, Cleon the 13th if you're keeping track, was a little messed up from the hyperspatial travel of the jump. Considering the active ruler has never left the planet since the genetic dynasty took over, we can presume that he probably hasn't experienced this before, unless it happened when he was younger. Out of curiosity, he asks Demerzel what it's like to be awake during the trip. He mentions that the spacers, who are there watching over humans as they travel, are engineered for it, but he barely considers them human. This may turn out to be important later, but what stands out about it now is that these spacers are something different than what we know about from Asimov's other work. Demerzel tells him that when space folds, the human mind can't tolerate the discontinuity, which makes us wonder why Gaal's could whenever she woke up during her first trip on a jump ship. There's another question of what Demerzel was actually doing when he walks in on her. It looks like she's repairing her face, so does she have to do routine maintenance? When I first saw it, I thought maybe that's how she prepares herself to go in front of people, but then later we find out that she wasn't planning on leaving the ship. Anyway, in case you forgot, she's a robot. As they approach their destination, we learn a lot about Luminism as they talk. It's 15,000 years old, it predates the Empire, 3 trillion people believe in this faith, and they wear crystals made of salt that come from the Leviathan mines, and they pray by ritualistically touching it. Which is something we've seen Demerzel do in previous episodes. Because yeah, she does actually believe in this religion. Brother Day doesn't understand it. He says that she has a purpose to serve him and his brothers in the Empire. It's actually built into her code. And she explains by saying that the search for meaning is not always about the answer. It's also the process of seeking that enlightens. So the show is building up its own lore here. Zephyr Halima is definitely a threat to the Emperor's power, and we see that she has some pull when she's the first person to welcome him on his arrival. The fact that she's by herself, that there's no big welcome for the ruler of the entire galaxy, takes him out of his element. This all looks pretty great, especially the ship coming into the Salt Palace. And it's all in service to the premise that there's going to be a new Proxima. The previous one died. Brother Day meets with Zephyr Galat, who is the one that's on his side. She's in the lead to become the next Proxima, but the vote could go towards Halima. He tries to tip the scales by pledging to have the Empire build a moon-wide desalination plant so that everyone there will have fresh water, which seems to solidify things for Galat until the rebirth ceremony for the previous Proxima is interrupted by Halima, who just sort of walks in and makes this crazy moving speech for everyone there, where she says that the greatest crime against the mother is stagnation, which is basically saying that the genetic dynasty goes against their faith. The crowd is moved, even Demerzel bows with the others, and that leaves Day as the odd man out. It's not as if they're in a frenzy against the existence of the Emperor, but you can see that she's opening the door and may be charismatic enough to take them there. So while Brother Day's in a struggle to win the hearts and minds of the followers of the luminous faith, Brother Dawn is struggling with how different he is from those that came before him. We see this play out with Azora, the gardener who saw him jump from his balcony, and when Brother Dusk takes him hunting. On his first time out, he kills twice as many as Dusk's record, which he knows might be a problem, so he takes 3 of those and throws them in the bushes and tries to make out like they killed the exact same number. Brother Dusk tells him that only a man can replace the man after their hunt, and he takes him to a brothel where we learn that they sleep with women who have their memories erased afterwards so they don't have any recollection of what happened. He picks a woman that looks a lot like Azora and then doesn't sleep with her, and we see that Brother Dusk learns about this because he has her brought to him before her memory's wiped. Later, we see Dawn invite Azora into his room. He wants to show her the garden from the ledge outside his window. When she's reluctant to come out, he takes off his protective aura and offers to let her put it on. She declines, and we learn that he's colorblind, and this is a problem because he's different from all the Cleons that preceded him, and maybe this explains why he was so good at hunting, but it is one of his biggest secrets, and now she knows about it. In a gesture to earn his trust, she steps towards the edge and says, if I were trying to keep a secret, I'd push me off. And instead of killing her on the spot, he decides to kiss her, which is the last that we see of these two. Then we see his secret from the hunt get discovered by the mysterious Shadow Master Obrecht. In my episode 3 and 4 Book to Show video, I mentioned how this guy has shown up twice, 35 years apart, and doesn't look like he's aged at all. And at the end of his scene here, he walks away and just sort of disappears, which I'm not sure what they were actually going for there. It adds to his mystery, and I hope we find out more about what's going on with this character in the next couple of episodes. On Terminus, the Anacreon troops are at the crash site for the jump ship, and we find out that they're looking for Dorwyn, who they're sure survived, because the Empire is as good at preserving their people's lives as they are at taking the lives of others. Back at Terminus City, we see the aftermath of the battle, and we see two of the kids from the first episode who survived. It does look like a lot of people died in the attack. Salvor is still out cold. Farah decides to keep her alive because she thinks she's the key to the vault, which is a big unknown at this point. Dorwyn is more important to their plan, and they need some encyclopedists, and she mentions that they need to get going because the Invictus won't wait forever. The kids were hiding. They're eventually able to rescue Salvor, who explains that the Invictus was a ghost ship. It was this legendary Imperial destroyer that disappeared. So this is the big plan. The Anacreon think that if they can get a hold of this Invictus, it'll be their redemption. And they need some of those encyclopedists who have special skills that can help them take it over as far as we can guess. They tell them they just need their help and that they'll leave Terminus after they get what they're after. At first, the Foundationers don't want to help, but a shot in the leg to one of their loved ones gets the cooperation that the Anacreons need. Salvor and the kids make it outside. They run into her dad and Hugo. She wants to go after the Corvettes, and she believes that it's possible that Harry put her there to stop the first crisis. Based on this intuition she's been having, how she's feeling drawn to do certain things, and the vault waking up. On their way there, her dad tells her about Trantor, how things were actually pretty good, at least for his family, but he says they knew it was all built on lies. And even though he didn't really understand Harry's predictions, he did want to get with her mother, and she actually did believe in the plan. So it's the father and daughter moment, which does feel a little ominous as they approach the ships. We see Salvor take the lead, even though her dad wanted to go at first, and as she starts to put her plan in action, she's hit with a vision and is disabled right there in the open on the ground. And this vision's even more vivid than the previous ones, where she's in Gaal's clothes, and we see that she's on the slow ship. We hear the conversation Harry and Rach had before the murder. Harry explains that there's only one scenario where you leave the ship, and that's the one that makes it impossible for you to remain on board. I don't take my life, you do. Rach is not into this at all. He tries to say that you can fix this, and Harry's pretty adamant. He says everything collapses because you stay here with her, referring to Gaal, and that everything would be wasted. He says that the entire galaxy is pivoting on the actions of an individual, you. They go back and forth. He asks him if he trusts the math. He says he hates the math. He asks him if he trusts him, and he said he wishes he never met him. And he says that the cryopod is programmed for you. Don't stop to say goodbye to her. And he does go ahead and stab him like we saw. And at that moment, Salvor walks in, as Gaal did. And then in the present time, Hugo wakes her up and it ends there. They are seen, and a shootout breaks out where they have the high ground and cover, but her father's out there on his own. He's trying to get to the ships with explosives, and he almost makes it as Salvor's picking off the soldiers, but he does get shot. And then he ends up sacrificing himself, detonating the explosive, which takes out the Corvettes but kills him in the process. Later, after they get away, Salvor has another crisis of faith. She thinks that everything that's going wrong is her fault. She tells Hugo what she heard Harry say, and again, he thinks she's special, and she's resistant to the idea. But now that her father's dead, she's really motivated to get revenge against Farah. The episode comes to an end when they try to sneak back to his ship. They're caught right away because what else is Farah actually doing but waiting after they destroyed the corvettes? She orders her men to kill Salvor, and Hugo transfers control of his ship. He slaves it to her so that they'll need her alive. And they need him also because she doesn't know anything about piloting a ship. So Farah has everything she needs, and they load up, and the episode ends with them leaving the planet.
If this was really only about the past psychohistory laid out, then you would have let Cleon kill you in that throne room.
That's true.
So why didn't you?
I wanted to live.
We start off with the Terminus storyline. At the end of episode 6, Farah had gathered up the people she needed to go after the Invictus, and we pick up with them as they're approaching it. We get the story of some of the abandoned palladium mines that were there where Hugo used to work. Without the aid of the Empire's tech after the Starbridge attack, the industry just broke down. And when Farah accuses him of abandoning his people, he responds that it was more like there was one less Thespin to fight over the scraps. As they approach the Invictus, we get a little bit of history. At one time, it was the most powerful weapons platform in the galaxy, and it was indeed a world killer. It had disappeared 700 years ago, but it's been spotted throughout the galaxy since then, never responding to hails and never being seen in the same place twice. Commander Dorn says that because it's a jump ship and the Empire considers that tech a state secret, they would just as soon destroy it rather than let the Anacreons get it. We find out why they needed him, why they actually needed his body, and it's because of his Imperial nanobots. They're there in his bloodstream. They can aid in fast healing if he's injured, and they can also be used as identification. And they know that they're going to need something like that because it still has active defense systems. They actually had 2 ships destroyed when they tried to approach it the first time. So basically they have to do a spacewalk in order to not trip off the alarm system. As they're getting into their suits, Commander Dorwin tells Salvor and Hugo that he has a built-in distress beacon. If they can get access to some form of comms, then they'll be able to send out a distress signal. And the idea comes up that they might be able to get access at one of the abandoned mining stations. So it's a big 10,000 meter jump. They all make it except for Hugo, who says his suit is malfunctioning as he floats past the inner ring where everyone else has just landed. I'm not sure if he did this on purpose, based on what they were saying just before that, but it definitely didn't feel like this was going to be his death, like that was it. Even though if it was a plan, Salvor doesn't know that, so she is actually pretty broken up about what happened. As they're approaching the airlock, they get a little bit too close together and the defenses kick in. The ship starts shooting at them. Commander Dorwin is able to get the airlock open. That shuts down the defenses. And as a reward, Farah kills him since he's already served his purpose at this point. They spend some time exploring and we get some more world building details. At first, the environmental systems are off, and they get those turned back on, and we see that they use artificial gravity of some sort. They notice that in regular intervals, the lights are pulsing, and Lewis thinks it might be a countdown when he notices that they're getting closer together. And we learn that the ship jumped to where it is now randomly. It just showed up there one day. And the current theory is that it is continuing to jump. It's what's been happening to it. The crew must have lost control at some point. And that's why Anacreon had to act fast, because they expect it to jump out again. So they need to figure out what's going on before that happens and it disappears forever. And when they examine the countdown, they realize they have about 4 hours until it happens. At one point, they encounter an energy barrier, and Salvor is able to disable that because she worked on the fence, which is a newer form of the same kind of technology. And figuring that out means that now they need her, because they're probably going to run into more of these. And so when they try to overtake the Anacreons, when they try to rebel and get their weapons, which doesn't work out, she gets to live. And with that story, that's pretty much where things are left. On the Emperor's ship outside of the Salt Palace, we see that Brother Day's in a pretty bad mood after Halima's speech. Demerzel explains to him that if she hadn't knelt, it would have been a clear contradiction of her faith, and they have an argument about where her loyalties lie. He points out here that her being a robot is a secret. He says, I wonder what Halima would say if she were made aware that Demerzel can't be reincarnated either. And he says that her actions were a betrayal of her directive. As far as he understood it, she was incapable of disloyalty. Her fealty to the Cleonic Dynasty should be above all else. That should be embedded into her programming. And she does counter all of his points, explaining that if kneeling were against her protocol, she wouldn't have been able to do it at all. There just wouldn't have been a way that she could have physically. So there's tension there. I believe as viewers, we're supposed to wonder about her actual loyalty, just in the same way he is. But they're interrupted as one of his aides comes in to tell him that Halima's speech had struck a chord, and she's now the frontrunner to become the next Proxima. When they go to talk to her, we get a glimpse of some pilgrims who tried to walk the spiral. Or maybe some of them actually completed it, but you see that they get pretty beat up in the process. We find out that Demerzel actually did it. She did it many years ago, and that many people die trying to do it. He tries to bargain with Halima. He wants to know what her ask is, what she needs to back off of calling him soulless and undermining his authority. And her answer is that she wants him to end the genetic dynasty. She says it's not a tactic, and that she really does believe that the dynasty has to end. Back on the ship, Brother Day acknowledges that Harry Seldon predicted a split with one of the major religions, essentially that Luminism would go against the genetic dynasty. Demerzel tries to assert her loyalty. She's ready to play defense and protect the Empire from Halima's message. But Day has a different plan. He plans to prove Halima and Harry Seldon wrong. He goes back to see her and he declares that he'll appeal to the triple goddesses themselves. He'll walk the spiral and he'll let them decide what is true, who is right, and who is wrong. And that's where his story ends for the episode, and he's set up to do that next time. Back at the palace on Trantor, Brother Dawn and Azora are escalating their relationship. We see her leave a message that leads to him finding her for a rendezvous where they have sex for the first time. She tries to give him a device that would correct his color blindness, and then he explains why he would never be able to use that. If the other Cleons found out, if they noticed what he was doing, then they might notice all the other ways he's different, which he fires off, and there are quite a few of them. To show her just how important it is that they don't find out, he takes her back to the palace where he shows her the original Cleon the First, and then takes her into this back room we hadn't seen before where they keep replacement backups for all of them just in case something happens. His reason for existing, the reason that they cloned them in the first place, is for them to be perfect copies of the original. If they can't do that, then they have to be destroyed, and their last day would be their replacement's first day. She tries to suggest that he should run away, and she has an answer to every reason he throws out there that he thinks it wouldn't work. She tries to tell him about where she lives. It's called the Scar, the area where the Star Bridge fell, where the lower levels were opened up and they can actually see outside. She points out how different it is in the palace and how everything's alive and it's waiting for him, and she really tries to sell him on it, saying that they can change his face and they can drain his nanobots, and we'll have to see how that plays out because I don't know if any of that will turn out to be possible or not. A little later, whenever he misses the dinner bell, Brother Dusk comes looking for him, where he makes the excuse that he was trying to learn about Trantor, and Dusk just says, "We are Trantor. Nothing outside the palace walls is relevant," and their story ends there. And in the final storyline, we finally get back to Gaal and what's going on with Harry on the Raven, the Harry Seldon Quantum Consciousness Protocol, which eventually stops glitching. She's able to talk to him and he comes back. And we find out that he had a data unit implanted in his brain before they left Trantor, and he finds out that they're on the Raven heading to Helicon. Rach was supposed to be there. Gaal was supposed to be on Terminus to lead the First Foundation, and when he finds out that Lewis is in charge, he says that that would be fine to get them through the settlement stage, but they'll need someone else for what comes next. They'll be facing the first crisis soon, which we've seen that they are in fact facing. She explains why she's there, what happened, that Raich has been executed, and for a while he starts glitching out again. And when he leaves this time, the life support systems blink out, and so Gaal's running out of oxygen just before he returns. He says that he owes her an explanation, and that his death was an essential element to the success of the plan. The Foundation needs more than a man to inspire it. It needs a myth that can endure for centuries. And it worked. His death galvanized the Foundation, and it's no big deal because he was dying anyway, so he took that as an opportunity to engineer the narrative. Alarms start to sound as they reach the debris field that surrounds Helicon's Dark Star. She knows where they are, it's the why she's struggling with, and she wants to know if Raich knew about everything, which he did. Harry was going to take his own life, and Raich would stay around to explain why. Then a week or so later, he would disappear, and they would reunite on the Raven. Because he fell in love with Gaal, Harry knew he wouldn't leave her behind, and she gets fed up when she hears this because he didn't warn her, he hasn't been telling her everything, and has been deciding what she needs to know. And it's pretty rough that he made Raich kill him so that he would have to leave her. She tries to blame him for what happened, and he points out that she's too smart to play the victim. They have a pretty good back and forth. You wanted a different life than the one mapped out for you, and you made a choice to lie to the Emperor. They agree that they're both hypocrites, as she points out if it were really just about the path that psychohistory laid out, Harry would have let Cleon kill him in the throne room. Everything still would have fallen into place. As they continue to debate who's responsible for Raich's death, Harry starts to push for an answer about why she was in his room the night he died in the first place. That leads into a sequence with her trying to explain and reminding us of all the different times she had feelings or knew something would happen, and then she turns towards the view screen at the exact moment she needs to stop a micrometeor right as it breaches the ship's hull. They realize that Harry couldn't predict that she was going to be there because whatever gives her this ability is beyond normal human behavior. She's different. And she describes it saying that she thinks she can feel the future as the episode comes to an end. Oh.
Don't give up yet, son. We're getting close.
Before we catch up with what's happening on the Invictus, there's a flashback to Anacreon where we see a young Farah experiencing the planetary attack. Salvor was able to pull these details whenever she was reading Farah earlier in the season, and here Farah says that after they were gone, talking about the Empire's ships, there were no children left, only warriors. And I guess it does a good job to set up why Farah's the way she is, how all-consuming her desire for revenge is, even when Salvor makes some great points about how terrible her plan to jump the Invictus into the center of the planet Trantor is. It would kill everyone on the capital planet, but her people and everyone else in the Outer Reach would be on the hook for that, and well, the Empire wouldn't let something like that go. The threat for Salvor is that if she doesn't help them, then all those hunters that were left behind will kill everyone on Terminus, starting with her mother. There's still a ticking clock situation until the next jump. Most of the scientists they brought with them are dead. When they finally disable the defenses, Salvor opens the door and she finds a gun on the ground. She fires it at Farah and is able to get inside alone with Lewis. There they put together what was happening with the crew. They find out that the captain killed herself there, and when they find the navigation cradle, we get a little bit of background and history into how jump ships evolved. This is from a time before they had spacers, so everyone on board had to sedate themselves before a jump, and we get an explanation that folding space was as much intuition as it was science. And the bottom line here is that what needs to happen is someone needs to connect their brain to the navigation AI to guide the ship somewhere safe, or it'll continue making random jumps. Problem is, this is a death sentence since there isn't time to do the necessary surgery, and because Salvor sees herself as an outlier, she volunteers and says that she wants to guide the ship to Terminus. As that's all playing out, we see that Hugo did find his way to a communications relay. He's not dead, he rerouted himself to one of the mine sites. He turns it on and he sends out an SOS to the Thespins. On the planet, Salvor's mother says they need to evacuate Terminus City because the null field around the vault is continuing to expand, and she thinks it's going to overtake them all, which is a tough thing to sell to the Anacreons in charge because they'd have to take the fence down. When we get back inside the ship, there's just 5 minutes left. Farah and Rowan are still outside trying to break in, and Salvor is trying to talk Lewis into hooking her up to the navigation. Here we see her thinking change. Because of her visions, she had thought that she was there for a reason, and now she thinks this is it. She's meant to sacrifice her life to get this ship to Terminus. But before Lewis can hook her up to the navigation, he gets shot by Farah. A fight breaks out between her and Salvor, and then we see the Thespins show up, but they turn out to be too late, and the ship begins the jump and disappears. So that's our cliffhanger, is where will it end up? Based on what we learned in this scene, they may find themselves somewhere pretty far away from the action going on Terminus. With Brother Day, we see that he's committed himself to a pretty serious risk by agreeing to do the spiral. He has to give up his protective aura and have his Imperial nanobots removed. And he has to take this trek with no food, no water, and no rest, where for the first time in his life he's going to be subject to injury. Less than half of the people who start this trip make it to the center. If they do, the goal is to make it to a cave in the center called the Mother's Womb that has a pool of water inside. There's special salt around it, and after you submerge yourself in the pool, if the mother is willing, you'll see a vision. Each one of these is unique and deeply personal, and a group of Zephyrs will interpret what it means. It's an interesting situation. It's not just physically difficult. If he doesn't make it, that would give Halima a huge advantage in her arguments against the dynasty. And we see the trip is a struggle. After he gets pretty far into it, he meets another man. They have a conversation where we learn a little bit about regular people in the Empire, people who live outside of Trantor. And at one point, when Brother Day drops to one knee after injuring his foot, this person tells him not to give up and helps him up. Later, the tables are turned, the man drops, and when Day reaches out to help him, he says that the mother is calling, and submits by dropping to his second knee. When Day tries to at least help him off the path where he'll be able to get help, he refuses, as he wants to die right there rather than being saved. He explains that a peaceful transition to a holier life is the mother's greatest gift. And because the Emperor doesn't have any faith in this religion, he tries to get him to change his mind. He says, what if there is no other life? What if this is just the end? The man just lays on the ground and says, maybe we'll meet again. You can tell me what you saw. And Cleon has to continue the struggle on his own. He finally makes it to the cave, and he finds the pool. We see him laugh with joy as he gets into the water, and it looks like he is experiencing wonder as we watch him splash the water over his sunburnt body and drinking it all in. That cuts to him in front of the three Zephyrs, where he explains what he saw. He said the salt started to move and it began to swirl, lifting off the floor of the cave. It formed a stem and 3 petals, and as he's talking, we see that Halima looks worried. The three Zephyrs, the representations of the Mother, Maiden, and Crone, talk to each other and then ask if he's familiar with the mythology around the birthroot flower, and he says he's not. They explain its significance, how whenever the 3 moons were created, the Maiden was covered in a blanket of birthroots, and it was a sign from the triple goddess that their world could sustain life. Over the centuries, the flowers died off, and they haven't been seen for thousands of years. They interpret this as a holy sign, 3 elements made out of 1, and he says, just like my brothers and I, to which they respond just like the triple goddesses. At the end, they're convinced that he's clearly not a soul mired in stagnation, and anyone who says that will be guilty of sin themselves. From this day forward, no other Zephyr will stand in the way of the genetic dynasty, so essentially he's won. Everyone bows, even Halima. Later, on the way back to his ship, he thanks her for inspiring him to attempt a spiral. And then Demerzel goes to see her in her room. She starts by saying that she wants to extend her condolences, and then they have a conversation where she admits that she can't go against the Emperor. She can't leave her role at his side, and then explains it was 11,000 years ago when she walked the spiral, which is basically her admitting that she's a robot. Halima had heard these rumors. I guess they're out there in the Empire that the last humaniform robot in the galaxy does assist the dynasty. And Demerzel explains that like Empire, she doesn't have individuated sentience. She must not be in possession of a soul either, because if she were, she would be able to disobey his commands, and it's clear at this point that she was sent there to kill her. We see that she's visibly struggling, and Halima picks up on this, saying that she sees genuine remorse. She doesn't know how she can tell, but she knows that Demerzel has a soul. On the other hand, the person that's making her do these things is truly a soulless man. She forgives her and tells her to do what she must. After all, she's going to be reincarnated according to her faith. She's already been poisoned through a secretion when their skin touched, and after assuring her that she'll feel no pain, Demerzel leaves. She goes back and tells Cleon and assures him that it'll look like she died of natural causes. Then she asks him if he saw the ancient birthroot flower on her desk, which is basically an accusation. She's throwing it out there that she wonders if he made his vision up. She explains that when she did it, she had a real vision, and that she would not wish that emptiness of seeing nothing on anyone. And it really is an intense showdown between these two characters. As the spacers are preparing him for the jump, we get confirmation that he didn't have a vision at all, that he was just there, and what Demerzel implied was true, which is a pretty big revelation, and I will come back to this at the end. From there, we go back to the Raven, and we hear Harry ask Gaal how long she's been able to feel the future. It's been happening as long as she can remember, and most of the time it's just a feeling, like what happened with the micrometeor, but other times it comes in dreams. Harry says that a dream drove her to mathematics, and that proves that it wasn't a dream at all but a premonition. He thinks she might have some intuitive processing ability that would put her ahead of the math, because that would explain how she was able to solve Abraxas. She wants to know why they're going to Helicon, and he still thinks he needs to keep her in the dark because this prescience of hers has the potential to skew psychohistory completely. After all, look what happened with Rach. She's there and he's not, and this creates a big problem between them. The most he'll give her is that mankind's survival is predicated on us reaching Helicon, and when she pushes, saying that she thought it depended on the Foundation, he explains that it does to an extent, but only if its sister organization is established as well. So there is a second Foundation that needs to be created at Star's End on Helicon. Terminus was created by an Imperial charter and was designed in part to draw fire. But the second Foundation and its location must be kept secret, even from the first. And things escalate from there because she continues to ask questions and he refuses to answer, other than saying that he has allies and resources on Helicon where they could safely study her gifts and possibly use them to their advantage. She says that her instincts are telling her to leave the same way that she came, and he points out the fact that it would take her decades to get to Terminus, she wouldn't even be able to go to Trantor, and that her best bet is to stay on the Raven. It all boils down to her giving Harry an ultimatum. Tell her everything, or she'll destroy the heat transfer system, which will cause her to die if she stays on the ship. He says he can't possibly do that, he can't jeopardize the second Foundation before it even gets started, and when she follows through, when she destroys the system, he has the choice of either letting her die on the ship or letting her leave. Eventually he does, and we see her walk through the door. She takes the knife out of the lock and gets back into the cryopod, and when she asks the navigation how long it'll take to get to Synnax, we find out that it's 138 years as she confirms the destination. So she's going back to sleep, headed towards a dead planet as far as we know at that point, and that should effectively put her out of the story for over a century. As I mentioned at the beginning, it is good to get some reveals. People who'd read the books knew that there was going to be a reveal at some point about a second Foundation. But even having that idea going into it, Gaal leaving here is a pretty big twist. I won't get into the spoilers of why that is because we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 2 episodes. But what's important here is that there's a second Foundation who are kept secret to help guide things, and it was always part of Harry's plan, and I hope we learn a lot more about it in the upcoming episodes.
You had no choice in any of this. But thank you, just the same.
So we'll start with Brother Dawn. He doesn't want to be killed and replaced, so he's meeting and planning with Azora to get out of there. And we learn that he's planning on leaving tomorrow and that he'll need a signal damper for the nanobots in his bloodstream. He gets summoned to meet with Dusk at the mural. They talk about how it captures their legacy. He mentions some of the different scenes, including the end of the Robot Wars, the Golden Horse Rebellion, and the attack on Anacreon and Thespis that we saw in the opening episodes. He's brought him there because he's added their hunt to the mural, and he's done this as a setup to test him to see if he's colorblind. He asks if he can see the 3 ghillie raptors that he shot, and since he can only see the blue ones, he says yes. After Dusk leaves, he uses the corrective device that Azora gave him, and he realizes that are 6, and now he's sure that Dusk knows he's different. He rushes in to pack a bag and leave, but before he can get out of there, Shadow Master Obrecht comes in, saying that Brother Dusk needs to see him right away. He tries unsuccessfully to talk his way out of it, and then he has to use his aura, which also has a weapon mechanism, to knock out the Shadow Master and then escapes to the garden. And this escape sequence, it seemed a little bit funny whenever I watched it the first time. I guess it all makes sense in the end that they were letting him go, because it felt kind of hard to believe that he was able to get out at all. He does though. He has this dramatic sequence that involves this water reservoir, and he makes his way outside the palace. He's on his own, he's freezing, and he trades the only thing he has of value, which is his aura, to one of the people that lives down there for his jacket. From there, he's able to make his way to the Scar, Azora's neighborhood, by remembering what she told him about it, and he eventually finds where she lives. She welcomes him and tells him not to worry, that she's installed the signal damper so he doesn't have to worry about being found, and tells him to take a shower. After he goes in, he has an idea about the new name that he's going to take, and he comes back out to find her with a gun in her hand, and she takes a shot. He's able to get outside of the apartment, but he's pursued by a group of goons, and then he's captured by himself. He looks up to see someone that looks exactly like him. When he wakes up, he sees that his Imperial nanobots are being transferred to a different clone, who was raised outside the palace. He explains to him that someone was able to smuggle some of Cleon's DNA out, and they've been working on this plan for decades. It's a coordinated effort, Azora was part of it, and it seems like someone powerful would have to be behind it because they're playing a long game here, and they have access. He explains all this with a British accent so you can tell them apart, which is kind of funny. But he shows him that he's been practicing, that he can copy him exactly, and the plan is for him to replace the original Dawn. They altered his DNA after the fact so that he would become different, and the replacement is an exact copy. The reason that they altered the DNA was because they needed to get him out of the palace. They wanted to orchestrate a reason for him to run on his own, fearing for his own survival. And when the nanobot transfer is complete, we see that the new clone heals immediately, so now he's basically just a normal person and has outlived his usefulness. But as I mentioned earlier, they let Dawn get away so they could follow him to these people. And so Dusk and the Shadow Master and a group of soldiers swoop in for a rescue. Fake Dawn is killed. Shadow Master Obrecht uses that cloaking device that we saw earlier in the season to sneak up behind and cut his throat. Azora is taken prisoner so they can interrogate her, and Dusk says that he wants a memory audit done on all of the dead people in the room. After they lead Azora away, Dusk explains that they would be able to overlook that, but the matter of his difference is rather more complicated. Dawn looks at it like he's a victim. There was a conspiracy, and it's not his fault that he's been altered. But I mean, come on. That's why they have the backups. This has been his dilemma the whole time. He's a reminder of their vulnerability. And Dusk basically says what logic is there to keep him around. Brother Dawn pleads for him to forget logic and try empathy. And in the end, it's not up to Dusk anyways. It's up to Brother Day, and he'll be back soon. And I suppose that it'll boil down to how he's feeling after his showdown with the Luminists. On the Foundation side of things, we see a flashback to a young Salvor talking to her dad. She asks them where they came from, and they talk about the origins of humanity. Humans are thought to have inhabited a single system, but they don't remember which anymore. He throws out the idea of Ceres, Alpha Centauri, and says that some people think we came from some place called Earth. All of this is leading to questions about Anacreons and Thespins too. How they're all humans, and they all came from the same place, so then how come they hate them so much? Her father tells her that rational thinking shares skull space with our emotions, and sometimes the emotions win out. Millions of people died when the Star Bridge came down, and then the Empire killed millions more, and who won? And he brings out that trademark phrase, violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. And he's using all of this to make the point that this is how they know the Empire's gonna fall. Past behavior is the best predictor of future performance. Salvor was able to stay awake for the jump, just as Gaal was able to when she traveled to Trantor from Synnax. It turns out that they did make it back to Terminus because Lewis connected himself to the navigation and got them there after he was shot, and of course he didn't survive. Since she's the only one that's awake and she can't get a hold of anyone on Terminus, she ends up leaving the Invictus doing a spacewalk to get back to her ship. While she's there, she reunites with Hugo, and they realize the null field is probably why they can't reach anyone on the planet. He makes the suggestion that they just run away from it all, but she says that she needs to fix this, and so he goes back to the Invictus, and because she's immune to the null field, she heads towards the planet. On the surface, it turns out they were right. Everyone's knocked out, and so Salvor heads to the vault. There she finds her mother passed out with the Prime Radiant in her hand. She takes that and she concentrates, and through memories, actually Gaal's memories, she remembers how to open it. And when she does, the vault reacts, it opens, and the null field is lifted. People are starting to wake up. On the Invictus, when Hugo and the Thespins arrived, they couldn't find Farah. It turns out she's boarding one of those Thespin Lancers and takes control of it. And at this point, everyone's heading towards the surface. Salvor moves towards the vault, and her mother tries to stop her, but then the Anacreons fire a warning shot. That's followed by the Thespin ships arriving. Everyone on board starts to come out, and these ships have this thing where the captain can remotely control the firepower, and so that's enough to get the Anacreons to stand down. Salvor believes this is where she's supposed to be. She sees everything converging in a single crisis. And things get more intense when Farah arrives in that Lancer and destroys the other ones that were already there. She has the same remote control device for the ship, so that gets the Thespins to stand down, and she wants to kill Salvor, who tries to convince her that the Invictus is the most powerful ship that they'll ever get their hands on, so why destroy it? Why not use it for leverage? She makes the suggestion that they all band together, and then she draws off her father's words saying, "Let our logic speak louder than our emotions." Farah's soldiers are receptive to this, and Rowan tells her that the hunt is over. Then something like a bolt of lightning shoots out of the vault, and Farah decides that shooting it with her ship seems like the best course of action. This isn't something that Salvor can let happen, so she uses the Grand Huntress's bow to kill her, which increases tensions with everyone. But then they're all taken aback when Harry Seldon walks out of the vault. He says, "Well, this is encouraging. Anacreons, Thespins, and Termini. Seeing you all gathered here gives me hope. We might actually pull this off." And the episode ends there.
Echo history. We are Empire. History bends to us.
I am loyal, Empire. To the Cleonic Dynasty above all else.
Episode 9 ended with the death of Farah, in the midst of the conflict between the different factions of the Outer Reach taking place on Terminus. Harry Seldon emerged from the vault, and he seemed alright with what was happening. In the finale, we get a better understanding of how he came to be there, and what it all means for psychohistory in the Foundation. He's a projection, and he explains to Polly, who asked him if he was the ghost, that he took a pill that contained millions of self-replicating molecular machines. Those broke his body down inside the coffin that he had made, and it recycled that material, transforming into the vault on its way to Terminus. So the vault is actually made of him, but over those decades he wasn't awake, he wasn't sentient that whole time. He explains that his reawakening was triggered by the Anacreon's arrival. He says that it takes time to rebuild consciousness, and when Salvor tries to connect things to the null field expanding, he explains that it's just part of the Vault's natural defenses. Harry addresses the Anacreons and Thespins, saying that they've hated each other for so long that the origin of their feud is almost irrelevant. And he explains that the first clone, Cleon II, is responsible for setting things in motion. The generations of hate between these two cultures that we saw was ongoing in episode 1 when they came to Trantor all traces back to what's called the First Betrayal, where Cleon II had his Shadow Master murder an Anacreon Grand Huntress and blame it on the Thespin king she just married. The point was that this marriage was going to bring together these two emerging powers in the Outer Reach, and that would be a threat to the Empire's power. So the Emperor decided to undermine that, knowing that it would get them to fight each other, and then he wouldn't have to deal with it. Now Harry says he needs them to put that behind them and come together. He selected the original colonists on Terminus to have the seeds of a future civilization, and the others are survivors. They've been cast aside by the Empire and they're still there. Under the genetic dynasty, there's only room for one story and one voice, and he believes that that stagnation guarantees that the Empire will fall, and that will be followed by a dark age that lasts 30,000 years. It was always part of his plan for these three cultures in the Outer Reach to come together. He explains that he found the pattern in the jumps of the Invictus, and that their discovering it would be a potential step ahead for the Foundation's development. He explains that the idea of them curating knowledge for the encyclopedia was only a cover story. The Foundation was never about that. It was about curating people. And when one of the Foundationers echoes what he says about them not being revolutionaries, he says that he may have lied about that point. There's still a problem in that the Empire is still going to come investigate what happened to Dorwin's ship, who was there in the first place to investigate what happened to the comms buoy. Harry tells them that they won't come if they think they're already dead, and he tells them to use the Invictus to create a false mega flare. Something like that would wipe out all life in the system, and therefore there would be no reason for them to come into a situation where there might be a dangerous star and a bunch of dead planets, even if it did host the Foundation at one time. After that, if they don't leave the Outer Reach, they would be invisible, and more importantly, they would be free. They can bide their time, build up their strength, and become what they need to be to shorten that period of darkness, according to psychohistory. As he gets ready to return to the vault, they ask if they'll see him again. He expects that to be the case because this isn't the Foundation's first crisis, and it won't be the last. They bought themselves some time, but war with Empire is inevitable. He tells them to remember this day, remember what they're striving for, and remember that 1,000 years can seem like a long time, but it's only a blip on the history of civilization. And if they're not vigilant, this opportunity that they have could slip right through their fingers. As he was talking, he realized Gaal wasn't there and that she never made it to Terminus. In that exchange, he meets Salvor, but it's clear that he didn't anticipate her or know who she was. So as he's leaving, she asks him about the visions that she's been having, and he doesn't know what she's talking about. She explains that she used them to help her solve the crisis, and he assures her that the visions didn't come from him, and then the projection goes back inside the vault and it closes up and it looks like it did beforehand. So what does it mean for the Foundation? We see that the cultures are willing to work together. There's an exchange where Rowan gives the Grand Huntress's bow to Salvor in an act of peace, and they plant a sapling from Anacreon together at the site of Farah's burial. Mari and the other Foundationers are angry, they feel betrayed, and it's not so much that Harry didn't tell them what was going to happen, but that he lied to them. Salvor's in a similar situation. She grew up thinking that the ghost was talking to her, that Harry Seldon was talking to her through the vault. She started to believe that she was special, and now she has no idea where the visions were coming from. There's a time lapse of the colony growing over the next few months. Everyone has come together and they're taking Harry's words to heart, setting aside their hatred in favor of strength and moving forward with the Foundation. They repair the Invictus and Hugo becomes the captain. He goes out and generates the Mega Flare, allowing them to be free. And now that they have the technology, we learn that it'll take them about 18 months until they can start building new ships. For her crucial role in the crisis, Salvor is set to become the next mayor, but she has another vision where she sees a young Gaal. She goes to see her mother, asking her about who the girl from the water planet was. This leads to the big reveal that Gaal and Rach were her biological parents, and the visions were related to their memories rather than Harry. She knows that Gaal escaped the slow ship in a cryopod and decides that she needs to leave Terminus and go look for her. She decides she wants to leave right away because she's afraid that she'll change her mind, and her mother gives her blessing and the Prime Radiant to take with her. She goes to the beggar and Hugo finds her before she leaves. They have their goodbye and we get an understanding of where her head's at. She thinks this is something that she needs to do alone. And when he asks where she's going, she just says that she has a hunch and she leaves. As has often been the case in this first season, where things get really interesting is on Trantor, and what happened to Azora, Brother Dawn, and the conspiracy. Brother Day has returned to the planet, and his trip to the Maiden has changed his thinking. Brother Dusk wants to destroy Dawn and replace him. And when Day goes to talk to him, he says, "You're not one of us. Your DNA has been altered in a dozen ways." He wants to know how long he's known, and this brings about a really interesting conversation about how they aren't even really people, they're just echoes of the first Cleon, and hasn't Day himself ever wanted to leave this place, be something more than just an installment in this ongoing story. When he goes to speak with Azora, he explains that he understands that people hate him, but says that his detachment from them is what makes it possible for him to rule effectively. It's a strange burden not being able to carry a burden. The brothers care for each other, they love each other, and they shift that burden between each other. He views Dawn as his son. He rocked him as a baby, he cultivated him, and Azora took all of that away from him. So he wants to take away her legacy, and they located every person, family, friends, lovers, and so on, anyone that would remember her after she was gone. It's a total of 1,551 people. They have them all under surveillance, and there's a particle beam focused on their brainstem, so that when he gives the signal, they'll all be killed. And right after he explains this, he gives the signal, so they're all dead. He then tells her what her fate will be. She'll be put into automated extreme isolation, where she'll be sensory shrouded, but she'll still be aware. And he's doing that so that she can remember what she took from him. And it's a brutal fate no matter how you look at it. Demerzel comes to Dawn, she tells him it's time, and on their walk to the throne room, he says that she must hate him. She assures him that's not the case, she actually loves him. And when he says that it's only because she's programmed to, she explains that all love is programmed, biological or otherwise, saying that when a human mother looks at her child, their brainwaves synchronize. When he's brought before Dusk and Day, it's clear that Dusk hasn't changed his mind at all, but he has to default to the middle throne. Brother Day explains on his trip he had much time to reflect on their dynasty. He talks about the pilgrims he met who worked their whole lives just to walk a spiral of salt in hopes that they might be granted a vision before they die. He talks about the challenge from Halima. He brings up Harry Seldon, how he prophesies something similar, and declares that a bow incapable of bending will eventually break. He says it's time the dynasty bent just a little. Brother Dusk is not willing to go along with this, and they start fighting. He's convinced that it'll ruin their dynasty, and he threatens to decant another day rather than allowing the altered Dawn to live. As they continue to fight, Dawn goes to Demerzel for protection, and she holds him like a child, stroking his hair. Brother Dusk shouts, "We are Empire, history bends to us," and as he's saying that, Demerzel snaps Brother Dawn's neck, killing him instantly. When Brother Day protests, yelling no, she tells him that she's loyal to the Cleonic Dynasty above all else. After he disintegrates the body, the Shadow Master comes to him to say that the rebels' plans to undermine the dynasty appear to be more extensive than they first believed. They thought the gene editing was limited entirely to Brother Dawn's person, and that it was done after he was incarnated, which is what the other clone told him whenever he was in the scar. After more testing, though, they found out that the source itself was adulterated. As were the replacements, those are no longer pure copies. So the source material is gone, Brother Dawn is dead, and they can't replace him with another pure clone. Even Day himself could be altered, they don't know that yet, as well as Brother Dusk, who's being tested right at that moment. He sends the Shadow Master away, and in a rage, he smashes the glass case containing the original Cleon I. Then Demerzel goes back to her room, takes off her salt bracelet, and looks in the mirror. She looks troubled, she opens her kit and grabs a tool before tossing it aside, and then tears her face off as she screams. And with a lot of unanswered questions about the future, the Trantor storyline ends there. So what happened with Gaal and Salvor Hardin? Well, we get one last scene that takes place 138 years later. We see Gaal arrive on Synnax. She's able to find her home. There's no signs of life there anymore, maybe not any on the planet at all, as we see that the water is much higher. As she's mourning, she sees a light under the water and decides to go find out what it is. It turns out to be the beggar, and inside she finds Salvor in a cryopod. She gets her out of the water and wakes her up, and when she asks her what happened, she explains that she crash-landed. She's been in cryosleep for more than a century and says that she was there looking for someone, which of course she was looking for Gaal, and she tells her, "I'm Salvor Hardin, your daughter," and then she hands her the Prime Radiant, and the episode ends there. So in the end, where are we at? The Foundation survived the first crisis and came out of it with an alliance in the outer reach that will make them stronger. One version of Harry Seldon's consciousness exists inside the vault to be a reassuring presence at the very least. The initial reason he got the Encyclopedist's exiled Determinus was a lie, but things appear to be on course for the plan, and psychohistory should serve its purpose to shorten the dark age that will come after the fall of the Galactic Empire. Periodic crises are baked into that, and Harry should re-emerge accordingly. Gaal and Salvor are mother and daughter, and they have these unique abilities they don't quite understand. They're together, but their future is uncertain. Considering they have the Prime Radiant, I have some ideas based on what I know from reading the books, but I won't go into those here. Their being on Synnax means that they're somewhat isolated, but considering the Foundation has at least one jump ship now, they could be reconnected without another prolonged period of cryosleep. Either way, enough time has passed that things are completely different on Terminus, and it's going to take time for that story to catch up to where they're at. The Cleonic Dynasty also has an uncertain future. The only thing that seems certain is that it won't be carrying on like it has for the last 400 years. They left things pretty wide open as far as whether Brother Dusk and Brother Day were altered, and there really wasn't any progress as far as finding out who's behind the conspiracy. Demerzel's final scene was fascinating, and I think one of my next videos will be talking about what I think's going on there. For now, it appears that Cleon I altered her programming to be loyal to the Cleonic Dynasty above all else, and the things that she has to do in relation to that are taking a toll on her. It'll be interesting to see how she responds to the dilemma of having no new clones or pure genetic material to continue the dynasty as they've known it. For a review, this first season had its issues, especially in the structure and pacing of the early-middle episodes. Overall, the Terminus storyline was noticeably weaker than the story with the Cleons, and there were places where it just didn't work for me. I'm sure some of that can be chalked up to the pandemic, but it also felt to me that they defaulted to try to do a cool action thing in a lot of situations with mixed results. I do give them credit for the effort though. Looking back, they did a lot of crazy things, and I think generally speaking, it's always good to see a show that takes chances, and I'm hoping that they'll be able to identify what worked and what didn't, and come back with a much stronger effort in the second season. There was a lot of effort to develop the characters, and again, I think this worked a whole lot better on the Trantor side of things. But as far as the finale's concerned, it felt like a step up across the board in that department. So at least it feels like they're going in the right direction there, even with having so many different stories that all felt somewhat different to tie up in 1 hour-long episode. From Asimov, they've got a toolbox to pull from that includes some great twists and turns based on psychohistory. And the part they introduced themselves, the Genetic Dynasty, has turned out to be a great addition. They managed to pull off some great sci-fi and character stuff at the same time. There's so much rolled up in that dynamic, and I love the progression of Brother Day through his trip, then coming back to his interactions with Dusk and Dawn and Azora respectively, only to be completely invested invested in what was going on in his decision, and then actually shocked at what Demerzel did. The thought of Brother Day being on the verge of changing things, only to have it snatched away by a failsafe that we have to assume was instituted by the original Cleon, that was the highlight of the season. The most powerful person in the galaxy is trapped in that cycle. There's really nothing they can do to change things, and now there's no way to continue that. So even with the issues it had, I'm pretty happy with where we're at. I'm curious to see where they go from here, and I'm glad I watched it, and I'm happy that they made it. It was ambitious and sprawling, and you can't take that away from it. This thing was huge, in scope and budget. It was a proper spectacle at times, and there's a lot to like there if you go looking for it. And I think that's a good place to leave things. I do have a lot of questions though, and I'll be following this up with a Season 2 questions video sometime during this week. So let me know what questions you have for that in the comments. And let me know what you thought of the season, what you thought of the finale, and if you want to talk book spoilers, just make sure you mark them. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.